Very good morning to all of you. We're just going to wait a few more seconds for more delegates and guests to come and join us. And we'll shut the doors so we can formally begin. Excellent. I believe we have shut the doors. So wonderful. Buongiorno, Milano. It is so fantastic to be here. My name is Sharanjit Lail, and I'm from Singapore. I've come all the way to be here with the ADB in this beautiful city, and we are so grateful that all of you have joined us on this day. We are one of the first two panels to kick off the ADB's annual meeting, and it is truly a privilege to moderate it with my esteemed panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, and of course to have you all with us as well at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So thank you all for being here. Please give yourselves a round of applause. Excellent. And of course, we'd love to hear from you during this discussion as well. And there is a chance for you to pose your questions to our distinguished speakers. And you can do so on an app called Pigeonhole. We're going to bring up the QR code shortly. If you take your phones and your devices out, you can scan the QR code, and we would love to hear your questions to our distinguished panelists, which I hope I will get a chance to ask them at the end of our 90-minute session. So if we can scan the QR code, I believe we are meant to be putting up the QR code for Pigeonhole. Can we do that now? So everyone gets a chance to ask their questions. Yes, I'll give it a second or two. If not, at some point the QR code will come up and you will be asked those questions. Here we go, there you go. We want you to join the conversation, so absolutely, please do take your phones out, scan that, and ask those questions at the end, which I will have a chance to ask our distinguished panelists. So, once again, welcome, and we are so grateful for all of you to be here. This is a very important conversation that we're having. As I said, it's the first of two panels kicking off the ADB's annual meeting here in Milan. And of course, it is arguably one of the most defining issues of our time. It has dominated headlines over the last few weeks: trade wars, tit-for-tat tariffs. Geopolitical fragmentation is another word for it. But we know, though, that despite the fact that it has dominated the headlines, it's been going on for years. The IMF and other organizations have been warning about geopolitical fragmentation for many years now. But let's remember, we're here to talk about globalization, and it was once hailed as the engine of prosperity, lifting millions out of poverty, especially in Asia. And yet today, trade barriers are at their highest in a century. I'll let that sink in. That is quite extraordinary. So how do we make sense of this shift? And more importantly, how do we get back on track towards a model of globalization that not only uplifts, but sustains and connects us all? And that's exactly what we hope to unpack over the next 90 minutes of this session. So I'll go ahead and introduce our wonderful panelists. Next to me is Albert Park, the Chief Economist from the Asian Development Bank. Arantxa Gonzalez is the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po and the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. And we also have Thomas Helbling, who is from the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department. He is the division chief there. And finally, we have Ottavio Ricci, the chief economist from the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. And we will be so excited to hear from all of you. So let me begin with the first question, which is really a scene-setting question. It's a chance for you all to give us your perspective on the discussion that we're about to have, and also the role that your institution or your government plays in this evolving landscape. So let's begin with you, Albert. What's your take?
Well, I think right now, above everything, it's the uncertainty itself over future direction of trade policy, which is challenging decision makers everywhere, from investors to government officials and to multilateral development banks in terms of how we can best support our member countries. As you mentioned, Asia clearly has benefited historically from open global markets, many incredible examples of export-led growth. And so in our charter at ADB, there's a commitment to promoting regional cooperation and integration. And our message has been very consistent, our past president, our current president, that we still encourage our countries to be open to multilateral trade and investment. We still see this as the way of maximizing opportunities for development, especially for poorer, smaller economies. And so in this environment, that continues to be our message. Let's use this crisis as an opportunity to deepen regional economic integration, which is something that has been happening naturally over the past 5 or 10 years, but there's still many ways to deepen those commitments to each other even further.
Wonderful. So deepening trade integration is something that we hope to talk about. And Arantxa, what is your take, very briefly?
Well, my take is that we are moving in a direction where probably we're going to rely a little bit less on efficiency and a little bit more on security. That we're going to have a little bit less cooperation than we have seen in the past. So we're moving into a new normal. But in this new normal, we have to remember where we come from and what is it that brought us here. What brought us here is that globalization, open markets, cooperation, work under 3 conditions. Condition number 1 is that you have openness with rules internationally. Condition number 2 is that you have domestic policies at home, that you do your homework to make the changes of openness, but also of technology that keeps on moving forward, manageable, that you deal with the winners and you deal with the losers. And let's remember number 3 and final, that it's better when we do all of this in a cooperative manner than when we do this in a conflictual manner. And if we want an example of why conflictual does not work, let's look at where we are today. It does not work. So these are my 3 conditions, but let's not forget there is still a lot of scope to win from openness, from integration, and from cooperation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for summing that up so well. And of course, we'll be talking a lot about those issues in this discussion. Thomas, what is your take from the IMF perspective?
So the IMF perspective, of course, is given in our Articles of Agreement. Paragraph 2 in Article 1 says, the purpose of the fund is to facilitate the expansion and balance growth of international trade. It's mostly indirectly through the international monetary system and keeping an orderly international monetary system. But the IMF has long emphasized the benefits of open trade for growth, development, and so on and so forth. At the current juncture, the IMF continues to promote or emphasize the benefits for all members of having an open and rules-based international trading system. At the same time, our managing director has said there are grievances currently in the international trading system and has called upon the members to resolve these in a constructive way and has offered the IMF as a forum for cooperation and collaboration. And thereby facilitate finding a solution. The IMF doesn't have direct trade policy responsibility, but it tries to make intellectual contributions. At the same time, at the moment, we're also calling on our countries and say, while there is the current trade uncertainty, which obviously countries have to manage from a macroeconomic perspective. We've also emphasized that there are also other ways to promote growth. One is the regional integration angle. Maybe we come back to that also in Asia. And the other is other structural reforms, right? Trade is clearly essential for growth, but there are many other opportunities to address obstacles or promote growth, including education, infrastructure, and so on and so forth, which also ties in with our macroeconomic mandate. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Ottavio, from the Italian and the European perspective.
Okay. So there were many words of wisdom that have already been said. What can I add to that? First of all, you asked us to tell a bit more about ourselves. In my case, I work at the Italian Treasury. We draft official planning documents and so forth. But going to the issue of our conversation, we are also involved in analyzing the impact of, you call it trade war, let's call them trade frictions, whatever. And we have been asked to estimate the impact of tariffs. And we went mad because there were so many possible combinations. One result that was always in place, that no one really gains out of it, especially if countries start to retaliate. So I think wisdom will prevail, and there should a new equilibrium should be found. Now, this is coming also from the perception, I'm quoting, Besant, so it's not a statement of us, that the current pattern is unsustainable with one country being the main debtor, and all others, creditors. The situation has to be tackled, and if imbalances are there, it's because, domestic policy, as Arantxa mentioned, should be improved. Maybe domestic demand in US is too high. Maybe in China is too restricted. And you have to find, a middle ground. But I stop here. Maybe we will discuss further this issue later on.
Absolutely. Thank you all for giving us this opening perspective of what's going on. And of course, let's take a look at what got us here in the first place. And it's interesting, Ottavio, because you ended with that idea that perhaps there's kind of a need for restructuring going on with major economies, with the US and China and others. So let's have a look at what brought us here, what led to the situation that we're facing right now, and perhaps the two people I can ask are Albert and Thomas, because they've just attended the IMF World Bank spring meetings in Washington, D.C., where all the talk was about the trade war, or the trade frictions, as Ottavio calls it. Give us a sense of what was being said there and how people are feeling about the situation right now. Do you want to pick up, Albert?
Sure. Well, the other thing that was happening in Washington, D.C. was we had lots of ministers of finance and other delegations from many of our member countries, and many of them were trying to find opportunities to start talking with the U.S. administration to start to carve out details of agreements that would kind of resolve the trade disputes or the concerns being raised by the U.S. side. And I think that's for the good. I think we all want cooperative solutions and agreements. And so lots of concerns about what was likely to happen, and uncertainty, as I mentioned, about what was likely to happen. I think for some countries, you can even use the negotiations with the U.S. as a lever to push through trade liberalization reforms that maybe have been felt. Like, for instance, India now seems to be talking about trade liberalization with more seriousness than it did in the past. And I think many people, including I think myself, have really been recommending that India do liberalize its trade. Tariffs in India have been going up steadily, and they want to be a globally competitive economy. I think that's somewhat of a hindrance and reflects certain maybe protectionist sentiments or concerns about industries not being ready for competition. But I think the history shows that, you know, there's no way to like be fearful. I mean, if you want to use globalization to generate growth, you have to really embrace it almost wholeheartedly, especially today when the world is so competitive that everyone is competing for the strategic industries, the high value-added industries, especially a country like India. So if the politics of a country are such that the government would like to proceed but is dealing with domestic interests, then this is a way actually to maybe push reform, domestic reform through. And it reminds me of what happened in China, where I'm very sure that the leaders were using the negotiations with the US over the WTO as a way to convince a lot of very strong domestic industrial interests that we have to make these commitments and we have to liberalize and we have to open up, make some concessions as well to open up the country to competition. Maybe I'll stop there.
Wonderful. And it's interesting you mentioned the WTO, so we're going to go to them a little bit later. But Thomas, what was the sense that you got from having attended those meetings? What is the current macroeconomic situation that we're dealing with right now? And again, in the second half of the conversation, we hope to find ways of how do we fix it. But let's hear from you, Thomas.
So similar to what Albert said, there is in the conversation with our Asian members, I'm in the Asia Pacific department, so we mostly met with Asian countries, there was a strong interest in maintaining an open trading system. I think that sentiment, that interest is very strong in Asia, given recent economic history, recent economic development. I think there was also very strong interest in strengthening regional integration, see it as a force. We were asked many questions how to improve regional integration, what to do. At the same time, of course, there were big concerns about what the current trade tensions mean for the region, for growth and employment. And the trade shock or the tariff shocks that we just experienced have the potential to disrupt growth and employment and increase vulnerabilities in the region considerably. So the question what to do, how to deal with the vulnerabilities, how to build buffers and so on, that was, of course, the topic of conversation. And as mentioned before, at the moment there is big uncertainty about where the trade system will reset to. We're at the moment left with a situation where extremely high tariffs between the United States and China persist. For the other countries, there's now a very large tariff differential in trade with the US. In principle, that could continue to promote this trade diversion from which some countries in our region have benefited over the past decade or so. At the same time, there's very high risk to this model of hoping or building on trade diversion. So everybody tries to see where the trading system will reset to. And as our managing director said, it's an opportunity, but also a challenge. But I think we're still very early in the process, and we hope for a solution.
Thank you, Thomas. And as you say, early in the process, a lot of uncertainty. So what is it going to take to try to alleviate those big concerns and the uncertainty and the short-term sort of situation that we find ourselves in? And this is where I'm now looking to Arantxa and Otavio, because is there a sense that perhaps Europe could take a leadership role when it comes to policy, when it comes to reassuring the rest of the global economic system, and perhaps Europe could take a leadership role in supporting sustainable globalization next? So Arantxa and Otavio, I'll let you answer this.
Well, my starting point would be that if we look at what has happened in this let's say 100 days, we see a winner. And the winner is globalization. It's counterintuitive, but the one that has won the battle so far is globalization. And why is it? Basically for two reasons. Because the level of interdependence in our economies is extremely high. So you know that when you want to go too harsh on disconnecting from the global economy, you are shooting yourself in the foot. You cannot do that without massive costs to your own economy, let alone the other economies. Your own will suffer. Your own consumers will suffer from high inflation. Your own producers, who also have hidden inputs in these perceived imports. If you take the iPhone, a big part of the iPhone is royalties to American companies. So let alone the part of globalization that has to do with debt markets in highly indebted environments. So let's say that what we have learned from these last 100 days is that interdependence needs to be better managed, and I very much agree with Thomas. We have imbalances and dysfunctioning in those imbalances that in this interdependence that needs to be corrected. The second thing we have learned is that we better do this cooperatively. This is a little bit seen from Europe. This is what we see in Europe. I mean, for us, we are very clear that interdependence is a source for good. We are very clear that we have to manage these interdependencies better, and that we want and we need to do this in a more cooperative manner. So this would be, in essence, the European quote-unquote position, understanding that in the meantime, like everybody else, I mean, if you look at what Europe has been doing in these last 100 days, is open markets to other countries and other regions in the world. It's done this with Mercosur in Latin America, it's done this with Mexico, it's done this with Switzerland, and it's now looking big time to Asia, to Thailand, to the Philippines, and to the CPTPP. And it's no coincidence. But we need this very clear message that it's better managing interdependence, it's not trying to run away from them, and it needs to be in a cooperative manner. That's what Europe will stand for.
Thank you, and let's remember that phrase, globalization is the winner from the last 100 days, because obviously it's shown us so clearly what happens if we don't have globalization, if we swim against the tide of globalization. So thank you for that. Ottavio, what is your take on Europe's leadership?
On the fact that globalization is the winner, yes, most likely. Let's say that it's difficult to kill it. It is resilient. We know why. We know that globalization, after all, is made by companies, and companies engage with other companies, establish links. There are costs, fixed costs to overcome when you establish these links, and so to step back is very difficult and costly. If there is a temporary shock, then globalization stay in place, prevails. If the shock is permanent, then globalization will find a way to survive, maybe not the best way. If there is, diversion of trade, what you will end up with are longer global value chains, which are more fragile. And this is why we have to look for a better equilibrium rather than a worse equilibrium. Going to Europe, I would say, I agree completely with Arantxa. I will make 2 points here. Maybe Europe is making progress also in terms of having a better idea of what competitiveness is. Competitiveness is not necessarily about running a huge trade surplus. You also want to, sustain domestic demand, and progress has been made recently in Europe, even if this progress was pushed by dramatic events. By all means, Europe can take the lead, but there are, it has to be handled with care. What do you mean by sustainable growth? If you want to preserve the environment, then we know that it can be quite costly to developing countries to impose, green standards, I would say. So we have to handle it with care. Nonetheless, Europe has shown the willingness to push forward, the green issue more than other, let's call them blocks.
Thank you. That's very good. And what I'm hearing is globalization is resilient. So this is good. We are in favor of globalization. We think it's not dead yet. And in spite of all the uncertainties, it is resilient. So that is a wonderful way to put it. And again, Europe's sort of political leadership that many countries are looking to now, it is there. But again, with multilateral institutions, that's something else has come up as well. With the current situation being the way it is, can we still look for multilateral organizations to take the lead, for instance? And when it comes to trade issues, has, for instance, the WTO lost its ability to mediate? So let's look closer at that. What kind of role multilateral institutions play, particularly ones like the WTO? Can we try to fix the situation now using those kind of levers that we relied upon in years past? Will they still work? Arantxa or Albert, would you like to pick up on this?
Yeah, it reminds me of Mark Twain, news of my death have been greatly exaggerated. So news of the death of the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system, in my view, have been greatly exaggerated. I think it's right now that people realize, it's again, a very paradoxical, that it's now that that the WTO is being questioned in a big way. And let's say that it's being questioned in a big way because the three big principles of WTO is basically that you fix tariffs through a reciprocal negotiation, that you have the principle that you respect the principle of non-discrimination, and that you are more generous towards the poorer countries as a rule. And right now it's like the three are upside down. But it's now that also the 87% of world imports that are not the US, it's like the US is 13% of world imports. 87% is the rest of the world. They realize also now the value of the World Trade Organization. A figure, 80% of world trade today takes place under MFN conditions. 80%, 80. This means WTO conditions. So I think the 87% of imports have an interest in making sure that the multilateral trading system keeps working. Under new rules, under a revised version, and in my view, this revised version will have three ingredients that we have to better define and better calibrate. First is going to be a more protective. Probably it's going to have a higher degree of tariff protection and non-tariff protection than we've seen in the past. And we have to calibrate it and say how higher. Second, it will have a greater state intervention compared to markets. And again, there too, we have to define under which conditions. And number three, it's probably going to be more variable geometry than it has been in the past, with more use of plurilateral agreements as opposed to only multilateral. This is, in my view, the new normal we're moving into, but we just need to make sure that this new normal is fixed at a level that would provide the stability and the predictability that a system is meant to provide, which is what the system, quote unquote, has been providing up until now.
Excellent. Albert, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, sure. I think in the current environment, there's some short-term things I think that ADB wants to do to be there for its member countries, to provide, on the knowledge side, some insights about what to expect in the region's economies if under different scenarios for how tariffs will unfold. But as well, to be ready to work with governments if there are scenarios that create short-term shocks and liquidity issues, to be there to provide trade finance and to be there to provide even budgetary support to support countries in addressing this shock and really any shock that they may be facing. Now, in the more longer term, we've been supporting regional cooperation forums for many years in many of the sub-regions in Central Asia with China, in South Asia, ASEAN, Pacific organizations. And that's really it's really using ADB's convening power to say, let's work together, let's talk, let's resolve not just trade issues, but a whole set of issues confronting countries in the region in a similar way. Let's address regional and global public goods in a way that's cooperative, as Arantxa said, and can be productive.
Thank you. And thank you all of you who've been busy writing your questions. I see a lot of great questions on Pigeonhole, which I will be asking at the end. But let's pick up on this idea that, who's going to fix this? And again, Albert, you've mentioned it, and Arantxa's mentioned it, this notion that perhaps we're going to have to look to regional trading blocks. I know you don't like the word trading block, but will it be a series of patchwork agreements with different regions that we're looking to now as a new form, this new normal, Arantxa has been calling it, this new sense of globalization? Will it come down to these patchwork agreements with regions as a way to kind of mitigate the fact that we don't have globalization anymore the way we knew it? What's going to happen next? What is this new normal? Describe it to us. And at this point, I'd like anybody to pick up. Yes, Thomas, go ahead.
Maybe when I joined the IMF a long time ago, the IMF was very skeptical about the regional trading agreement. And the main reason for concern was discrimination against countries outside the region. So the most favored nation principle, I think, remains very important. Over time, though, the thinking about regional trading agreement has changed. They have functions that go well beyond just discrimination. There is gravity in trade. Regional trading arrangements can facilitate trade, can facilitate integration more broadly. It's not just about shipping goods or services across borders. It's also to facilitate process, to facilitate knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, to facilitate investment or the movement of labor. And for all that, these agreements can help and set the rules. And then there has been long a patchwork, right? I mean, you have the multilateral trade scene, and then you have the regional trade scene. And the fact that in Asia we have seen more regional trade agreements, I think that we see this as a good development. It will help our members. I think many of our members are still emerging market or developing countries, so there's still scope to develop institutions, and there is synergies from doing together. So we see a lot of benefits from that.
Great. Albert?
Yeah, so in our Asian Economic Integration Report, which we released earlier this year, we take a look at these trade agreements in the region. And Asia has seen a growing number in its global share of trade agreements, I think reflecting this commitment to open trade and investment. But we also found that trade agreements in Asia tend to be shallower in terms of both the scope of areas covered and also the number of countries involved. And that when we do an analysis of how these agreements have impacted actual trade flows, they seem to have more muted impacts than trade agreements in other regions. And one of the reasons may be that the trade provisions could be more clearly, precisely defined. Also that companies need to be trained in some sense about how to take advantage of these agreements. Technical issues like rules of origin or harmonized standards need to be addressed. And because there's kind of a noodle bowl of agreements in Asia with ASEAN, ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus Japan, ASEAN plus Korea, and then when you have an RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, we find that the number of companies that actually are citing RCEP as the agreement under which they are claiming benefits is actually relatively low still. And there's still opportunity. RCEP is a living agreement where it provides provisions to continue discussing new areas and adding definition to the terms of the agreement. And right now, the most robust part, the fastest growing part of international trade is digital services trade, and services trade more broadly, which is facilitated by, obviously, new technology, digitalization, which is making it possible. And that's an area where countries like Singapore have been leading, creating digital economy agreements with some countries, but that can go much further, and I think there's interest in promoting it. There's a lot of issues to resolve for digital services trade. The barriers to that trade are still relatively high, but there's opportunity here. One of the sensitivities, of course, is about data flows, where people also link it to security concerns, their privacy concerns, which are viewed differently by different countries, et cetera. But I think many people see this opportunity. We're doing a study with Development Research Center under the China State Council, and one of the topics is also service sector liberalization, where there's also a focus on digital services trade. So.
Thank you. And interesting, you mentioned digitalization technology. That's something we're going to get to as well. But let's go back to this idea of regional patchwork trading blocks. And will this be the answer? Ottavio?
I can add a few points to that. I think it's very relevant to work on, especially on standards, because they are less visible barriers, but more costly. So I think mostly small and medium-sized companies will strongly benefit by this kind of agreements if well pursued. I would say that also, let's think about Europe. You never end improving even on regional, let's say, agreements. Let's call it that way. We have, the trade agreement within Europe has been established for decades. But still we are talking about deepening the internal markets, which tells a lot about how much can further work on that. The regional agreements are also useful to experiment, with rules. What really matters is, in this case, the interoperability of, regional agreements, because otherwise, you will, lose overall consistency.
It's a good point. And ultimately, we are here in the EU, which is the most incredible form of a regional trading area. You could say there's been great success with it, or perhaps failure. Brexit, anyone? So is this something that we should be looking to, once again, to try to create these regional trading agreements that are deeper on many levels, perhaps less shallow than the ones in Asia that you talked about, Albert? Arantxa, I see you nodding your head.
No, I think it's at a time when doing this at the global level, it's going to be much more complicated. You will see a lot of experimentation at the regional level or at the cross-regional level. I see a lot of interest, for example, between the Caribbean and Africa to work together to establish trade links that don't exist today. I see a lot of interest in the European Union and the countries of the CPTPP to start discussing what new rules could be built. So a bit this sense of incubation, maybe, of regulations that either are very weak at the multilateral level or don't exist because we don't have them on resilience of value chains, on technology, on the governance of artificial intelligence, on data management, on critical raw materials. I mean, there is a lot that regions can do in terms of experimentation and therefore prepare maybe the ground for action at the global level.
Thank you. Yeah. Thomas, did you want to pick up on that, this issue of reverting to sort of regional corporations, the deeper integration for the rest of the world because of what we're seeing with the trade issues at the moment?
Just, there is scope. If we look at Asia, one of the issues is sort of developing the regional market. If you look at Asia, much of the success of integration has been the build-up of value chains that ultimately, to a large extent, have catered to final demand in Europe and the United States. But we also see developments now that increasingly these value chains also cater to final demand in Asia. And I think as per capita incomes rise in Asia, there's much more scope for that. Intra-regional trade within Asia linked to final demand in Asia is still relatively low, and there is scope. So I think we see that as an important development and as an important hope. And as Albert mentioned earlier, I think the opening of India will of course play an important role in or has the potential to importantly change the regional dynamics and perhaps unleash sort of another sort of leap in or growth leap forward as in Asia.
And just to speak to Thomas's point, we calculate some quantitative indicators of regional economic integration, and we found, in our most recent report that Asia Pacific looks a lot like EU, UK in terms of the degree of regional economic integration, the focus on regional economies. It's now the case that most trade by countries in Asia are with other countries in Asia, and most FDI coming into countries in Asia are coming from other countries in Asia. Both of those are now over 50%, but I mean, barely over 50%, but I think it's signaling that there are these growing opportunities to really have many opportunities for globalization just within the region.
Good point. Wonderful. Well, let's pick up now on what was touched upon earlier, this notion of digitalization, technology, the need for knowledge sharing, and let's talk about that now, because are we now at a point where at a risk of cutting ourselves off from the kind of scientific, technological progress and knowledge that essentially got us through the COVID-19 pandemic? It was a coming together of scientific research that enabled us to get through that crisis. So what's needed now to protect global knowledge flows, whether it's in science, digitalization, AI, and others? And this is something that's going to be a major theme at this annual meeting as well, because we'll have a number of digitalization panels later on this week. Let's talk about that, knowledge sharing. How crucial is it? Are we at a moment where perhaps it's being threatened? Albert, do you want to pick up?
Right, so at these meetings, we're launching a new report on harnessing digital transformation for good. And a lot of the focus of that is how can we make digitalization more inclusive for the poor? I mean, in an international trade setting, I think that is still an important issue about how do we make digitalization work for poorer countries. Part of that, I think, will require the countries themselves to make progress on building up their digital infrastructure, their digital literacy, so that more of their firms and their people can be part of the digitalization opportunities. And of course, there are a lot of issues still to be resolved about standards, about agreements on how to govern data flows, et cetera. But in particular, that's important for the small and medium enterprises, which are really, really critical for making globalization inclusive, right? For a small company, you don't really have enough staff to address very complicated trade export procedures using paper sent to ministries. It all has to be digital, it all has to be paperless, it all has to be easy, and that requires a kind of capacity building for economies, for countries to really invest in. But I think the returns are high, given what we're seeing in the data. Even though global trade as a share of GDP has been pretty stagnant in recent years, The digital trade has just continued to grow at 5%, 6%, 8%. So its share of global trade continues to increase.
Yes. Anyone else want to mention that?
Yeah, I want to pick up on this last point by Albert. Trade in goods, trade in manufactured goods, plateaued long time ago. The part of international trade that keeps on growing is trade in services. And the reason why it's trade in services is because technology has made tradable a number of services that were not in the past. And this has opened a whole new set of markets that did not exist. Now, for this to work, you need a number of conditions. And here again, we have to make sure that we do not embark into digital nationalism, because that will kill these opportunities for trade in services, which is, by the way, where everybody wins. If you look at the US, this is where they've got their big win today. This is where they have an incredible surplus, including in trade with Europe. This is where a lot of emerging and developing countries have new opportunities. So we have to make sure that we build the standards, we build interoperability, we avoid digital nationalism, and we invest in people. Because at the end of the day, that part of international trade is a function of two big variables: digital infrastructure and human capital. These are the two things that we need to care about if countries want to tap into this potential.
Wonderful. Anybody else want to make a comment, Ottavio?
Yeah, I would say that on top of what has been said in terms of building human capital, skills, and so forth, it is a tough nut to crack. I would say this one of the digitalization. It has quite a lot of implications. To ensure, you have to find a way to balance, for instance, property rights with, making sure that knowledge flows continues. You mentioned, the success of US. It is maybe less known that debt of US, foreign debt of US, it's a large extent in terms of stock is driven by the rise of share values, which are owned by foreigners. And this huge increase of share values is related to highly successful digital companies, okay? So how do you don't want to, have these values to crash, for sure. It will destabilize the world even more, but you want, to have them to have a smoother behavior with respect to the past. And how do you deal with that? I mean, this will bring us to, a very complicated discussion, but I wanted just to make the point that everything is more related that you will think of.
Thank you. So certainly something that we will be paying a lot of attention to, digitalization, over the next week. And as you say, Albert, the ADB will be releasing its report, Digitalization for Good. From digitalization, I'm going to move on to the global crisis. That's something else we cannot forget. There's extreme weather, there's health emergencies, there's financial volatility. Of course, all of these don't respect borders. So what will it take to rebuild the trust and the mechanisms for meaningful innovation and cooperation amongst the international community? Can we still do it with the headlines that we've seen over the last few weeks? Thomas.
I would say yes. If you look at climate, extreme weather events, work continues. At the IMF, we have the RST. We have RSF arrangements. In the Asia-Pacific region, we have an arrangement with Bangladesh and Papua New Guinea. If you look there, what's different about these arrangements compared to our normal balance of payments financing arrangements is that we have much closer cooperation with other development partners. In the RSF with Papua New Guinea, for example, we have 10 reform measures. Each reform measure has one partner, including one where we work with the ADB, and on the implementation, on providing on providing capacity in Papua New Guinea to improve the ability to strengthen resilience and deal with extreme weather events. We also work on scaling up climate finance with partners. So we have our contribution is through the RSF, and other partners contribute to scale up. And I think there's still a lot of momentum in that area. Other areas are outside our mandate, except of course in the financial area, where I think there's a lot of momentum in digital finance, setting standards, setting rules and regulation, and the IMF is participating there. So cooperation continues, and even if it's perhaps not as much in the headlines as other developments on the globalization front.
Thank you, and always good to hear those concrete examples that exist, that are actually making a difference. Ottavio, did you look like you wanted to say something for a moment?
Yes, something, but no, the point is that in this case it would be very important, the role of the World Bank, of course, and in terms of financing exactly this kind of projects. But
yeah. And the ADB,
that's everything I had to say.
Albert?
Yeah, I mean, one concrete way in which I think MDBs will continue to step up is that even though, of course, we're seeing a decline in overseas development assistance, most notably with the closure of USAID and then most recently the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the US and shrinking budgets in Europe, all of the MDBs are actually planning to scale up their financing because of the capital expenditure kind of capital adequacy reviews that were done recently, which have allowed banks to leverage more against their capital, the amount of lending they do. So ADB's plan is to increase annual lending from something like 24 billion a year currently to up to over 30 billion a year within the next 5 or 10 years. So there will be plenty of work to do with that financing. A lot of the efforts were related to, I think, understanding the needs for climate finance. And as well, MDBs are also really focusing on supporting private sector development and mobilizing private sector finance, enabling private sector finance, because we all realize that MDB finance and government finance is not going to be nearly enough to tackle all of the needs for both mitigation and adaptation. So in that sense, I think we can be optimistic that the work continues, really. And despite all of the consternation about the headlines we read every day, I think in many ways, the long-term commitments and engagements that many international organizations have been committed to, I think, continue and improve and strengthen and mature. We also entered, recently into an agreement with the World Bank. We have a mutual reliance framework where we can now do projects with the World Bank at larger scale without having to do 2 sets of paperwork. We rely on one business process procedure and governance procedure for just one of them, but we can co-finance more freely. And so that is also generating momentum and coordination and cooperation. But as I said, we also work closely with our member countries in various formats.
Thank you. And again, that is truly wonderful to hear that the work continues in spite of all the headlines that we've been seeing. Arantxa, I see you're nodding your head, and did you want to add a comment on this?
Yeah, this is the time for multilateral organizations to step up and to do this discreetly, because if you step up too visibly and too vociferously, you're going to be taken down. But there is a bigger space to do this. Whether it is to build new rules, let's look at what the World Health Organization has just done with the new pandemics treaty. whether it is to maximize the capital that exists in many of these multilateral institutions to channel financing there whether it's needed, whether it is to step up on monitoring and providing transparency. Right now it's going to be very important that multilateral organizations like the IMF, like the ADB, like the World Bank, like the World Trade Organization, do transparency, run the numbers, put figures on the table that will help countries in making the decisions, whether it is to protect themselves or to invest for the medium to long term. And finally, I see there is a bigger space in these institutions to be the spaces where members talk. It's incredible that sometimes you need to do that. You need to create the spaces where members can talk. They can listen to each other. There is a big trust deficit that was created also, let's not forget, by too long an isolation during the COVID crisis that we are now also paying the consequences of. So big time for multilateral institutions, in my view.
Thank you. And again, over the next few days, that's exactly what we aim to do, is to talk. Now, I notice, and I know that there are many, many economies in the room who attend these events. So as a policymaker in a small or medium economy, some of you may be sitting in the room, and you're facing these external shocks due to rising protectionism, what can you actually do to mitigate some of the issues that you're facing? So I'm going to turn again to my distinguished panelists. What kind of advice would you give a smaller economy on how to manage what's going on right now? Albert, I know you have some ideas.
Well, I think it was mentioned before by Ottavio that you need to work on your own competitiveness to build a business environment, infrastructure that can really position you to be part of globalization. One reason why I really keep emphasizing that countries need to double down on globalization is that if you look historically over the last century plus, the periods of, there's a really great volume book by the World Bank led by Paul Collier and David Dollar called Globalization, Growth and Poverty. And what they point out is that in every period of globalization, you've seen the countries that participated in that globalization grow faster, and you see convergence among the countries participating, meaning the poorer members actually do even better. And most recently, in the most recent period of globalization they look at from 1980 to 2000, where it was the first one where lots of developing and emerging economies were participants in the globalization. Earlier periods was actually mostly advanced economies. And it was the only period where developing countries were doing so as manufacturers and exporting manufactured goods. And this was incredibly powerful for driving global convergence and improving. And one of the reasons for that is that as technology accelerates, you really get productivity growth by transferring existing technologies to your country. And if you're not part of the globalization game, as technology continues to just accelerate in the speed, really you're going to fall behind. So you really have to embrace. And even as I go to many member countries and talk to governments, I sometimes feel that there's a complacency because there is some growth happening. It doesn't seem so easy to really implement measures for promoting FDI or trade liberalization. There's pain points for doing that. But I think if you take a historical view, that's really where all of the payoffs are. And so we need to stay committed to that and to double down. And a small country needs to position itself. Even though there's challenges now, there's still also opportunities. And global value chains are becoming more complex. In a world of complex GVCs, a poor country actually has more opportunity to get into globalization because they can specialize in a very small part. They don't have to produce the whole good. But once you get into a global value chain, then you have the opportunity to move up that value chain. And by being part of the value chain, you will learn things through both your suppliers and your customers that will help you get to the global frontier.
Yeah, great advice. So if you're a small developing country, globalize. That is the ultimate piece of advice that you can have and take to come away with from this conversation. And I guess as an example is, you cannot be isolationist. Look at North Korea. And that's an example of the worst that can happen if you don't globalize. Anyone else with some ideas on strategies that smaller countries can take? Thomas?
So at the moment, what we're also emphasizing is more on the traditional macro side. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. And for most countries, the actual trade shock has been relatively small. The other bigger shock probably at the moment is the uncertainty shock that holds back investment, spending decisions. And so our message there is risk management, or as it's sometimes put, keep your house in order. Be ready and allow for also flexibility, not just at the firm, at the micro level, but also at the macro level. So build, preserve fiscal buffers. So targeted intervention if there's some need for support. And also I think it's important here to highlight for small open economies exchange rate flexibility to allow for shock absorbers in the absence of financial turbulence. I think that will also provide for flexibility as trade flows, knowledge, international division of labor will change. And I think that will remain important.
Thank you. Now, we have about half an hour, and I notice I have a lot of questions. So thank you all of you who've been posing questions on Pigeonhole. I will get to them very shortly. But I guess just as a question that, again, I'm sure we are all facing the sense of uncertainty of not knowing how we will come through all of this. My final question to all of you, and I will pick up with more questions later, but I'm going to go to Pigeonhole just because there are so many questions, great questions from all of you in the audience, is what should an updated, resilient, global trading system look like in 2025? Do we still have it? Are we still managing in spite of all of these concerns that we've seen in the last few weeks? What does it look like? So, Albert, let's turn to you.
Yes, I think we do, and my main final thought is, just to emphasize what I've been saying, let's double down on global integration, and let's be committed to open multilateral trade investment. It's still such an important part of creating opportunities, especially for the poorer countries and for broad groups of workers in countries.
I should add, it's not a final thought because we've still got lots of questions from the audience. So Arantxa, what is the new system? What do you see happening, and what does it look like?
Now, the new system is to be built, and let's say that the most important thing to remember is that it is important to have a system that, a little bit more protection, a little bit more state intervention, a little bit less multilateral and a little bit more plurilateral, which is, in my view, where we are heading, has to happen within a framework that is a system to all its members. And that's what will be difficult to do. Now, I would have one piece of advice in this system is remember to protect the most vulnerable. Remember to not put the most vulnerable right now at the front as a target. Remember now, this global community should do the utmost, and I hope this is a message that the ADB community can send, is that those that are most vulnerable should be excluded from the fight that is going on at the moment. They should be included in the definition of the new system, but exclude them from the fight now. Don't make them more vulnerable. This is such a, in my view, this is something that we could all contribute to as a low-hanging fruit.
Thank you, Arantxa. Thomas.
I don't have that much to add, really. I think in terms of moving forward to the new or the reset system, I think what will be important to have an understanding and for rules for state intervention, subsidies, and industrial policy. I think that will be important. The other point, just from the environment, as we have emphasized, this is also the time to address macroeconomic imbalances, in particular, as we have noted at the spring meeting, addressing domestic demand weaknesses in some, or say overly too much strength in domestic demand in some of the larger economies, also to keep macroeconomic balance in the global economy.
Thank you. Ottavio.
I will start from his last point, in the sense that there's certainly need of more coordination in terms of macroeconomic policies in order to very gradually reduce the imbalances. This is crucial. Going back to the need for globalization, I would say that maybe we are paying the failure of the 2001 Doha rounds, in which not only tariffs were not completely dealt with, but also there were issues about, agricultural and service sector. So the answer is really more globalization in terms of, and there are, again, homeworks that each country has to do. And, there is pressure on fiscal policy coming, from this trend, but you really have to be very careful on how you use it. Resort to subsidies to a very minimum extent and keep some space to, let's say, soften the impact on the poorest section of the society.
Absolutely, yes, the poorest must be protected. Now I'm going to move to these questions now. There's a lot of questions. Thank you once again for posing them. And I'm going to go with the questions with the most votes. There are 2 questions that have received 3 votes each, so I shall start with the first. What real progress has been made in Europe-Asia cooperation, and is there now a greater urgency for talks with the current situation? So Ottavio and Arantxa, perhaps you can pick this up. Or in fact, if Albert or Thomas wants to pick up as well, please do. Is there a greater urgency for talks between Europe and Asia as a result of the trade war?
I could start quoting Arantxa in the sense that, one of the answers of Europe is to, engage more trading partners. So, and I suppose, this meeting is, also one of the answers to the questions. There are, issues about and fears in terms of what's going to happen, for instance, to Europe's manufacturing sectors, and pressures to resort to protectionist measure, and these worries can be overcome just by resorting to dialogue with Asia. But of course, when I talk about Asia, is not just a threat coming from China, is to engage more countries. I mean, Italy is I'm talking about Italy now, is an exporting country. It is in our interest to export more, but not to increase our trade deficit, but to improve the links with other countries to which we want to cooperate in order to make both more competitive and increasing trade flows.
Thank you. Arantxa?
No, I mean, it's not as if Europe and quote-unquote Asia is a continent. And in this continent, there is a huge variety. But it's not as if Europe was discovering Asia now. I mean, sorry, but I mean, there are huge relationships already between Europe and the many different parts of Asia, starting with the fact that there is already an important network of trade agreements that, are old and have proven, by the way, their value. But I do think there is now a new momentum to maybe because by and large, this Europe, quote unquote, Europe and Asia do believe still in the value of open markets, do believe in the value of globalization, do believe in the value of cooperation. They can now probably take more of a leadership role internationally also to stand for a more orderly world in 3 areas that, in my view, Europe and Asia see eye to eye with. First is on trade. Second is on climate, because we are still got to deal with climate. And if I look at Asia, there is also, given the impact that climate is having on many of the Asian economies, a desire to find cooperative spaces to deal with it. And the third one is on the governance of artificial intelligence. So there is, in my view, a sweet spot now to give it a more political dimension, probably, and more visibility and more leadership than it has been done in the past.
Thank you, Arantxa. And I'm going to pick up on the climate because there's lots of questions about that. But did you want to mention something, Albert? Yeah? Okay. You look like you were poised to say something. So I'm going to move to the climate issue now, which unfortunately we didn't really get a chance to talk too much about in this session. It is all about globalization. It is all about how to mitigate some of the current issues that we're facing. But how can we speak of sustainable development when climate action is being downplayed? Another question, how is Asia's focus on climate transition affected by the shift in trade patterns? So ultimately, yes, climate is still an issue. It is a big one. We need to hit net zero, and many countries are under those targets in spite of the fact that the US has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol. What can we do now to ensure that climate remains a key issue? Albert.
Well, so one thing related to trade is very straightforward, and that is, we've been arguing for some time that we need to try to protect environmental goods and services from protectionism tariffs, even if we need to carve out separate agreements on those things, because it's so important for the transition to net zero for countries to be able to access global clean energy technologies, resources, equipment at a cheap price to encourage more and more effective investments to address the climate challenge. And so it's very unfortunate that because China is a main producer of EVs and batteries and solar panels, that it's caught up in this geopolitics with the United States, and that's creating all sorts of protectionist pressures around these types of goods, which are so important for the transition to net zero. So I think that's the main concern. Of course, there are other issues related to trade and climate, including CBAM, which has drawn concern, as was mentioned by countries in the region. Although, when we analyzed the impacts of CBAM in Asia, they were fairly modest because Asia doesn't tend to export a lot of the goods covered by CBAM to Europe. But I think in a world where that might expand, which may be possible, since people seem to be more willing to impose various types of fees on trade, then that becomes an issue. On the other hand, you could argue that this will encourage carbon pricing reforms in the region, which is a good thing. And we're actually seeing that happen. We're seeing more countries put in place emissions trading systems, thinking harder even about carbon taxes, and that will make their policies, of course, more aligned with Europe and should make it more feasible to manage some of the concerns that may be arising. But I think trade is critical. Asia is producing, one of the reasons Asia is producing so many greenhouse gases is that it is specializing in a lot of manufacturing activity, which produces more emissions. But that's to the benefit, of course, of other countries' emissions, in that those countries don't have to produce those goods because they're being produced in Asia. But there needs to be efforts to make the production of those traded goods cleaner, because we have found that the goods involved in these global value chains do tend to be more emitting, maybe of the nature of the goods that are being produced. So there's enormous work to do in different countries to promote greater energy efficiency of production, regardless of trade, but which would, of course, impact how trade magnifies or doesn't the global emissions problem.
Thanks, Albert. Arantxa, you were nodding vigorously, so would you like to add to that? You talked about the climate issue earlier.
No, I think I fully subscribe to Albert, and this may be an area where Europe and Asia, quote unquote, have now an opportunity. It's true that we need to reduce emissions faster, and if I look at Asia, it's still on an upward trajectory, and we need to move faster because of the imperatives where we see to keep within the boundaries that science tells us will be less disruptive of our own economies. And this means, to a large extent, decarbonating our energy systems. So there we have an opportunity, in my view, to work together. We can also, second, deploy capital at scale to help those that don't emit but are on the short end of the stick in Asia. And we can together do the same thing in other parts of the world, like Africa, for example, where the needs for finance are even greater and the capital is even more complicated to deploy.
Absolutely, great advice. Anyone else want to pick up on this question? Nope. Ottavio.
Maybe I can add a few words of hope from this point of view. Starting from a problem, which is, the idea of pricing emissions is very difficult to manage because it can lead, Europe is at the forefront, but how our policy can, have an adverse impact on countries that have less advanced environmental standards. So we have to cope with this issue. On the positive side, yes, US withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but they didn't show, eventually a complete, closure to the issue. They simply have a different, let's say, they not fully, maybe they do not fully internalize, the emission costs, but still technology is making progress. I mean, as long as you are able to carry out projects which are environmental friendly and efficient, I don't think there will be no obstacle on the US side. So we have to, engage the US and at the same time, to push forward and to make a lot of effort to further improve on the technology.
Absolutely, and as you said, we have seen great strides with that in the last, I believe last year was the first time investment into alternative and renewable energy finally surpassed investment in fossil fuels. I believe that's a correct statement, where the investment is still there, the money is still being pummeled into ways that we can achieve net zero. It is so vital. Now, another question here, which I think we touched on a little bit, but perhaps useful to ask again, a question from Moonju Kim. What's ADB's and other multilateral development banks' approach against the current trade war? Are MDBs trying to convince big players, including the US and China, to stop? Or are they finding solutions with given situations? And I think we addressed this when we talked about multilateral organizations and what they can do. So perhaps, Albert, I'll let you answer that question.
Yes, that's a difficult question. I think ADB tries not to tell countries what they should do in a paternalistic sense. I mean, I think we try to point out what the consequences of different policy choices are and to advocate for cooperation to resolve conflicts that are costly, I think, of course, to the region and really to all sides. It was very gratifying to see that in Asia, other than China, all of the other countries basically said we're not going to retaliate. We had modeled retaliation scenarios, so it was great to see that that doesn't seem to be on the table. And I think, again, it reflects a view that that would make things worse, which is what the modeling shows us. Retaliation would make things worse. And so we'd like to say that, this was something we were pointing out even earlier. Last December we had scenarios where we were pointing out the cost of retaliation, and hopefully some of that message sunk in and helped contribute to the response, which has been to not retaliate and to really recommit to regional cooperation and integration, which was very apparent, for instance, at the ASEAN finance ministers meeting just before the IMF World Bank spring meetings. So is that answering the question?
Well, I hope it did answer that question to Mr. Moon, who asked it. Anyone else want to talk about the multilateral system and how it can still have a crucial role in managing the situation we find ourselves in? Thomas?
For us, it's very similar to what Albert said. We don't, in our surveillance at the multilateral level, at the bilateral level, we try to point out the cost and benefits of policies, informed debate. Our members have said, for example, that the IMF is not placed to assess, for example, national security considerations, health, or other considerations, but they have also said they welcome analysis of the costs and benefits, and that we have done in the past few years. We also, in our bilateral surveillance, point out spillovers of members' policies to other countries. And I think that remains important. And thirdly, I think by contributing to the debate and policy advice on the macroeconomic sort of background to international trade, we also hope that this will contribute to maybe mitigate the situation and pave the way for a new agreement.
Thank you. We have just 8 minutes, and I'm going to ask one final, well, perhaps this question from the audience, a final question, and then one question which I want to ask before we close. So if you can keep your answers fairly brief, let's start with this one. Sitting here today, are panelists inherently optimistic or pessimistic on the medium long-term outlook for globalization? Let's just go yes and no with this one, and then I'll ask our final question, which is really encapsulating one idea, one piece of advice. So let's start with you, Albert. Optimistic, pessimistic?
I always have to be optimistic, so I'll say yes, although a very hesitant yes.
Wonderful. Aracha?
I worked for the president, a former president of the European Commission called Jacques Delors, and he always said, don't be put in a situation where you have to choose between being optimist or pessimist, and therefore choose to be activistic. So that's my answer to that question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thomas?
I would subscribe to that.
Yeah, brilliant. Ottavio?
Optimistic, but there are a few so-called tail risks.
Wonderful. Great. Yeah, I heard a bravo to that. Brilliant. Now, before we close, we just have a few more minutes. If you could leave with one idea, one warning, or one opportunity with all the policymakers in this room, what would it be? Let's start from the other end now with Ottavio.
Can you repeat?
Oh,
Can you repeat the question?
One piece of advice, one piece of warning, or some sort of opportunity that the policymakers in this room could take away from this incredible session that we've had over the last 90 minutes talking about the current situation we're facing. What is your one warning or perhaps your one opportunity that you'd leave policymakers in the room?
Well, the advice is to be proactive and, engage, always talk to, other parties.
Exactly what we're here to do at the ADB Annual Meeting. Thomas?
I think the main takeaway, being open, openness, and embracing ideas from elsewhere, I think has proven to be a major motor for development, motor for improving welfare, living conditions, and I think that should continue. And my sense is There's also a very strong momentum, and that will not die. I think it continues. And just to mention, global trade continues. It has slowed, but overall it has not declined, neither in absolute terms nor as a percent of GDP. So I think that is
Thank you.
hope.
A good way to end a closing statement. Arantxa?
For open markets to be longer term politically sustainable at home, which is what's needed, and where in some countries is not politically sustainable at home, domestic policies are essential. So for policymakers, domestic policies. If I look at the US, it always strikes me that this is an economy that since 1990 has doubled the size of the economy. Double. It's added a new economy to the old one. The 1% of the US has multiplied its wealth by 4% in the same period. But the bottom 50% of the US has only seen an increase in 20% in its wealth. So there is a huge issue of inequalities. And this will not be solved by globalization. This needs to be solved by domestic policies at home. If you don't do that, you will not sustain politically open markets and further globalization. So please care about domestic policies to keep globalization safe and sound.
Absolutely, and that ties in with keeping your house in order, which we heard earlier. Albert, you get the final word.
Well, I think in the short term, we are in this period of tremendous uncertainty. I think governments need to really be attentive to understanding what the different consequences of these scenarios are, and to start being very pragmatic, getting their domestic policy shop in order, especially on the macroeconomic side, so they can respond flexibly to whatever emerges. But then going further, I've already said stay committed to open multilateral trade investment, but I think more broadly, stay the course and see through this period into the longer term goals, right? And that requires considering still many, many different aspects, especially climate, especially inequality, and thinking about how to position countries to have, balanced and sustainable development. And I think countries in the region have done really well at that, to be honest. I mean, from the pandemic, we've been just getting hit by shock after shock. Some of them are man-made, some of them are from disease, but there's been a great resilience in the region to these shocks. So I'm very optimistic. I'm not sure that our leaders here in these countries really need the advice, but I think I would say, stay the course, really, and see through this period into what are the medium and long-term goals.
Thank you. And that brings us to an end of this wonderful, one of two first sessions at the annual meeting, where we have looked at the issues at large. Globalization as a force for sustainable development. We've heard that, of course, globalization is a winner, globalization is resilient, that a lot of the work continues in spite of those headlines that we've been hearing over the last few weeks. So I hope that you will all leave this room with a sense of purpose, a sense of optimism, that perhaps globalization is still something that we can achieve in a good and a sustainable way, and it will continue to uplift the poor and the underprivileged around the world. Thank you all. Please give a big round of applause to Arantxa González, Albert Park, Ottavio Ricci, and Thomas Helbling. It's been an absolute delight to moderate this session with you all. Thank you. And I believe we have a final photograph to take. Let's do it. And thank you, dear audience, for those wonderful questions as well.